belongs all glory, honor, and power. We pause to reflect upon who you are today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your church. Thank you for the proclamation of the gospel. I pray the things said and discussed will honor your word in your heart. Shape us more into the people that you want us to be. By your word this morning, I pray that you are glorified. I ask for forgiveness for anything said that does not reflect your will. This time is yours. Use it for your glory. I pray all this in the holy name of King Jesus. Amen. All right. So, how did we get here? It all started when God called Abraham to leave home. God was intentionally taking a man and his wife and transforming them from people who had roots and a home to something nomadic, wandering strangers. In exchange, God promised to make him a great nation, Genesis 12 through 17. From Abraham, Isaac was born, the first in a line of descendants who would carry on God's covenantal promise, and he would father Jacob. Jacob, later given the name Israel by God, had 13 sons. 12 would become patriarchs of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. During this time, the growing family had arrived in Canaan, technically all the way back in Genesis 12, 6, and 7. At this time, the land was occupied by the Canaanites. Abraham and his family would be essentially strangers for, by my count, 3 generations in that land, and that God had promised them. But for now, the family seemed a little less robust than you would expect a nation to look like. Jacob would have 13 sons in total. His 12th was Joseph. The 13th would have been the younger brother, Benjamin. So it's like a snow globe out there. That's wild. Right. We'll power through this. It'll be great. Even though the family was growing, it was still very small compared to the greater nations around it. But God would soon take care of that. Could I get someone to look up Genesis 50, verse 24? Shout it out if you got it. We're not going to just... 50, verse 24. All right. Awesome. From here, the Bible tells the story of Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers and taken into Egypt. In Egypt, he'd have good days and bad days. But God was positioning Joseph into a place of leadership and authority. By continuing to obey God, he would save Egypt and, in a way, the known world from a famine. He earned great credibility and was able to reunite his family there in Egypt. There, his family settled with him. Joseph would die at 110 years old, but before he died, he would say in Genesis 50, verse 24,
"And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob."
Thank you. And after making his brothers swear to carry his bones out of Egypt, the final verse in Genesis says that Joseph was put into a coffin, and for 400 years, that coffin was never buried, likely to testify to the promise of God to return to his people and bring them to the promised land. Can someone look up Exodus 1, verse 8? Some 360 years pass between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And during that time, we're told that small family increased in size to around 2 million, many Bible scholars believe. In Exodus 1, verse 8 says,
"Eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done."
Right. The Hebrew text implies that the king did not want to know who Joseph was. This attitude dictated how he would deal with his Hebrew neighbors. Plan A was to enslave them, but by verse 12, it says they kept growing in numbers despite their oppression. Plan B was to get the midwives to kill the sons of the Hebrew women. And the text says that the midwives feared God more than Pharaoh, which again resulted in a national population growth. When times are hard, we don't expect to thrive. But here, God is growing them in spite of the cultural climate. In addition, we'll see how the cultural climate should not overrule our obedience to God. Exodus chapter 2 through 11, God raises up Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt. This would be arguably the biggest historical and theological event in the Old Testament. J. Daniel Hayes says in An Evangelical Approach to Old Testament Narrative Criticism, said, "The deliverance of Israel out of Egypt by Yahweh in the Old Testament is parallel in importance to the resurrection of Christ in the New Testament. The historicity of these events is a critical foundation for proper understanding of the rest of the Bible." Exodus chapter 15 through 17, this starts the wandering in the wilderness. God would provide for them manna and quail. And by this point, we're seeing the establishment of a relationship between extremely benevolent God, almost a sort of relationship you would expect between a parent and a child. Don't wander, obey, and let me love and provide for you. It was at this point that I recalled the account from God written by Ezekiel in Ezekiel 16, where he explains just the sort of God that he had been to Israel. Israel was a stranger, a misfit that no one wanted, a child in the way of the world, vulnerable and weak. He adopted this life that nobody wanted. And Romans 9:4 underscores this adoption, where it says, they are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. The second half of Ezekiel 16 verse 8 says, I made my vow with you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine. This people, God's chosen, is still young and ignorant in the ways of God, but God is going to respond to this. But first, let me pivot a moment and say there are a number of different kinds of covenants in the Bible, but for our purposes, we're going to consider two, the conditional and unconditional. Unconditional covenants are like the Noah covenant, where God promises not to destroy the earth with a flood again, or the Abrahamic covenant, which he promises to Abraham a line of God's chosen people. Essentially, there's nothing that you can do to change God's mind in how he's going to promise and act and do things. But now, starting in chapter 19 through 24, God gives the people, both the nation and individually, his law in the form of 10 commandments. And by chapter 21, we're introduced to the Mosaic law. These are the terms of the Mosaic covenant. This is a conditional covenant. In short, if you obey, things are good. If you disobey, things will be unpleasant. Both the Decalogue, the 10 commandments, and the Mosaic covenant serve to do what? What is God doing in establishing his law?
I mean, it's a relational thing. It's like, I'm good for my word. You have a choice.
Kind of like there's an ownership here a little bit in the relationship, that these are mine. That's what. Any other ideas?
This is probably off base, but I was just thinking this weekend that, why did he choose that people? And it's, because that people throughout the Bible illustrate the human heart and what happens when we turn away versus when we are right with God, because they fell away over and over and over again, but we do. It's just that he's illustrating his promises through the Jewish people and gave them, so much responsibility because they witnessed him, his miracles and the parting of the Red Sea and all of that, and they still turned away. So I think that relationship with the Jewish people is an illustration to us generically of what he, that relationship, when we walk with them or don't walk with them.
Yeah, sometimes we try to think that the capital W, we're, societally, that we're smarter and more advanced than these guys that they don't remember what happened 12 seconds ago. Guilty. But yeah. He's causing them to become more like him. Verse 75 in our text says, God was calling them to be a holy people, to have this relationship with him, to do what only Christ could do at the end of the day, and that is to follow God's will perfectly. And in a way that we become more like God is we care about the things God cares about. How do we know what God cares about? Well, Exodus 22 will help us answer some of this. Our lesson starts at verse 21 through 27. So we'll just start there at 21 in Exodus 22. You shall not wrong the sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Your version may say alien. And I think at this point, take a little little rabbit trail, I think it's good to get our definitions correct here. Sojourner, alien, migrant, refugee. Let's go over some of these. Sojourner is someone who resides temporarily in a place without the intention of making it their permanent home. The term sojourner often refers to foreigner or alien living among the Israelites, such as the Israelites themselves during the time in the wilderness, or those who lived in foreign lands temporarily. For example, Abraham in Egypt, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus when they went to Egypt, and early Christians exiled from Jerusalem. Migrant. While the Bible doesn't specifically use the term migrant, it generally refers to someone who moves from one place to another, often for work or better living conditions. The concept of migration can be seen in biblical stories of people moving for various reasons, such as famine or divine direction. However, the specific term migrant, as we use it today, is not specifically mentioned. Both of these groups, sojourner and migrant, were subject to specific laws and protections in biblical times, emphasizing fair treatment and compassion. And refugee, while I think it's safe to assume that we can lump refugee in with the sojourner definition, we don't really see that so much in the Bible. However, the U.S. State Department defines refugee as a person who is outside of their country of nationality and who has experienced past persecution or has well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership to a particular social group, or political opinion. And for the sake of saying it, they are vetted by the government and granted special official refugee status. But again, that term really isn't mentioned in the Bible, but I thought it would be necessary since all of these terms seem to be used synonymously with one another in our modern vernacular. So the directive is not to wrong the sojourner or oppress him. A good test of our moral character is how we treat the stranger. On the other side of this, the sojourner was expected to follow certain rules. Follow the law. Sojourners were required to abide by the same laws and commandments as the Israelites. This ensured social cohesion and fairness. See this in Numbers 15 through 6. Observe religious requirements. They could participate in religious practices such as Passover, but had to follow specific requirements like circumcision for males. This is Exodus 12, verse 48. Uphold moral standards. Sojourners were expected to adhere to the moral and ethical standards of the land that they were in Leviticus 18 through 26, amongst other things. So the question, why does God remind them of their history in Egypt here? Why do you think these memories were pleasant ones? So he's saying, you shall not wrong the sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt.
I think it was difficult. I think it was difficult for them to get roots.
And I think he might have been reminded also that they would get grace.
There you go. Consider this. It had been approximately 1 year since they left Egypt. No showers, quail sandwiches on manna bread every day. Every night is a camping trip. And now God is telling you to treat people better than you've ever been treated in your whole life. Do you ever think thoughts like, well, when I get my situation worked out, I'll help. When things settle down financially, I'll give. When I'm no longer exhausted from work during the week, I'll volunteer on a Sunday, which I know is not really the issue with you guys because you guys volunteer all the time and you're amazing at it. But maybe there are other when and then situations that are even more personal and more personal issues and relationships that you can think of. God is patient with us, but he also expects us to be obedient to the life that he has called us to. And he has called us to holiness. For Israel, their own experiences as strangers should elicit appropriate feelings of sympathy for strangers in their midst. God commands kindness and good treatment towards strangers, recognizing that while strangers may not always be welcomed, they should not be mistreated. The Israelites were once strangers in Egypt and were invited by Pharaoh in Genesis 47, 5 through 6. In contrast, their entry into Canaan was a conquest. Governments have the right to control borders, but individuals also have the responsibility to treat strangers with compassion and fairness. This section goes into the bare minimum. Do not exploit your neighbor. And Jesus takes it further. Do unto others. He moves from not just taking advantage of others and to actively seeking out and doing good for others. See this in Matthew 7, verse 12. Halfway down page 75 in our text, it says, the Hebrew word translated exploit means to do others wrong or even to treat them violently. The word translated oppress meant to squeeze or crush someone. The two words together convey actions that elicit pressure and hurt on someone. Verse 22 through 24. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Here God is coming to the defense of the weakest and most vulnerable in society. In a survival of the fittest mindset, they would have been the first to suffer. So I'm going to take a pause here, and thought we'd have a few more people here. So let's see, which questions do I want to pass out? What I'm going to do is divide the room into two groups, group one, group two. And I thought I'd have four groups. So let me figure out what questions I want group one to answer. I want you guys to answer question number 2. How can we on a personal level protect vulnerable people? Can you think of any examples in Jesus' ministry where he showed love to a vulnerable people or person? And I want to give you guys question 4. What steps can our church do to actively seek out the vulnerable in our walls and help them that we may not already be doing, in a way that we may not already be doing? So I'll give it about 3 minutes or so. And the easiest answer may not be the most complete answer. I don't know. All right, I'm going to bring us back. So what did we come up with?
You know, I'm not saying that I'm 100% either of those. I mean, I'm pro-life. I'm not necessarily anti-it, but it sure does give you pause when you think about the logic behind the two things.
All right. Group one. Group one, what did we come up with? See, it was question 2, right? How can we, on a personal level, protect vulnerable people? Can you think of any examples in Jesus' ministry where he showed love to a vulnerable person?
Well, I think you could probably sum it up with do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That is the short version.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as examples of ministry where he showed love to vulnerable people, you can think of children, you can think of old people, you can think of the woman with the issue of blood, the Good Samaritan,
The lepers.
the lepers, the paralyzed man. He seemed to gravitate toward those who other people fled from.
Kind of, it stands in contrast to the false proverb of Jesus helps those who help themselves, or God helps those who help themselves. These are people that they're not helping themselves. We can't in ourselves help ourselves. We need God outside of us to rescue us from where we are. You're absolutely right. Group 2. Or we can have like group 1 and group A. So however you want to do it. What steps can our church do to actively seek out the vulnerable in our walls and help them in a way that we may not already be doing?
The whole thing we come up with was volunteering more, but the question is within our walls, we're talking about this, say, church campus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I kind of drifted off of that.
Waving at people on the highway. What was the question?
What steps can our church do to actively seek out the vulnerable within our walls and help them in a way that we may not already be doing?
We talked a little bit about homeless, and I don't know what, I guess I've not been here or not been out enough to see what the homeless situation is in this area. But I know that where our son goes, we didn't even discuss this, but where our son goes to church, there's, I don't know how often they do it, but they have a weekend, I guess it's when it's really cold, a weekend that they open the church for the homeless to sleep
Do they
in.
do a room at the inn? A lot of churches do room at the inn. Our church we used to go to when I was growing up.
Okay, I
And
don't know
which
what they
is
call it, but
Basically that.
So he has to they'll ask for volunteers that'll come and stay there,
Mhm.
and they'll feed them.
Yep.
And give them a warm place to sleep.
There's something to be said for the in the walls. How do we get people more in the walls so that we can develop those relationships and do
Outside
that?
the walls to get them in the walls.
Yeah. Yeah. In 1932, Pearl Buck won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel, The Good Earth. Pearl was a daughter of missionaries in China and spent much of her life there. She wrote, "The test of a civilization is the way it cares for its members." Do you think this is true? Do you think that this could apply to the church? The test of a local church is the way it cares for the vulnerable. In verse 22, God says, "You shall not mistreat any widow." Was there a temptation to mistreat widows? You and I may feel nauseous at the idea of mistreating someone so vulnerable, but the sad answer is yes. There is, wherever there is a weak person, there will always be one willing to take advantage. The other day, I saw the Jason Statham movie, The Beekeeper. I don't recommend watching it with your pastor.
It's scary.
There is language, and it's not an endorsement of the movie. It's a Jason Statham action movie.
Yeah. All you have to do is say his name and you can make your judgment there.
He's a beekeeper. There were bees.
It sounds like something we'd like.
And it may not add to your edification, but for the sake of the illustration, the beginning of the movie introduces us to a lovely elderly woman. Her only desire seems to be to live out in the country, to have a private life, to take care of the charity she manages, and be kind to Mr. Jason Statham when he visits. She's retired with a handful of investments that exist to help her live out the rest of her days in peace. As her story goes, under the guise of help and charity, she ignorantly, unwittingly, and unknowingly gives a nefarious scam artist her passwords, and he proceeds to drain every last bank account, brokerage account, and credit card she has. The Beekeeper is just a movie, but that sort of thing happens. Ransomware attacks exist, and they don't care if you're 25 or 75. Have you ever gotten a text from the Postal Service that says something like, "We have a package for you with an incorrect zip code. Please go to this link, fill out this form, and pay this processing fee so we can deliver your package," or something like that? It's strange how they can find your phone number but can't find your zip code. The FBI.gov reported scams involving senior citizens totaled $3.4 billion in the year of 2023, and that's just the ones that have been reported. Deuteronomy 14, 28, and 29 teach that every third year that Israel was to spend some of their tithe feeding the widows. Job 24, 21 talks about how the wicked man does no good for the widow. Isaiah 1, verse 17 says, "Plead for the widow." Acts 6 began the deacon ministry specifically designed to care for widows and daily and give them food on the daily. 1 Timothy 5:3 says the church is to honor widows and who are widows indeed, and the word honor is referring to financial support. And James 1 verse 27 says that pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their time of distress. Sean Thomas at SeanEThomas.com compiled this. And if you want to adopt the heart of God, find a widow closest to you and do something good for them. Here's a story I came across. I thought it was really sweet. Being the strong wife and mother she is, Diana Register often hid her deep pain and suffering from those around her. In the weeks and months following her husband's cancer diagnosis, Diana would search for hiding places where she could let the uncontrollable waterfalls of painful tears flow from her eyes. The closet was a favorite, the shower. But when I wasn't home, it was the parking lots that became an asphalt-covered oasis, she writes. After her husband passed away, parking lots were Diana's safe haven for grief. One day, she was about to place her order in a Dutch Brothers coffee drive-thru. The wave of sadness hit her like a tidal wave in the middle of her conversation with a friend. "I could barely catch my breath and ugly crying started," said Diana. "The problem was I was stuck in a coffee line at Dutch Brothers, the one place where all the workers are young and happy, jamming to music, and there was no way out. I was literally blocked in, so unless I wanted to back up into the SUV behind me, I was about to be seen for the mess that I was." The barista at the window handed Diana an iced coffee with a sweet, simple note scribbled on top. When I looked down at the cup, I saw it, a pink straw and the words, "We love you," written around it. The girl didn't know Diana's pain or her story, but she knew that she was hurting and couldn't fix it. The ironic thing about it is that in loving her neighbor, the barista was used by God to bring comfort that surpasses all understanding. She wanted me to know I wasn't alone, and that whatever trial I was going through, that there were people out there who cared about me, that regardless of knowing all the details, they cared anyway. So in verse 22, in that same breath, God calls for care of orphans. Deuteronomy 10:18, he executes justice for the orphan and the widow. Job 22 verse 9 and 24 verse 3. Psalm 94:6, they slay the widow and the stranger and murder the orphans. Isaiah 1:17, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Jeremiah 7:6, do not oppress the alien, the orphan, or the widow. The minor prophet Zechariah 7:10 says, do not oppress the widow or the orphan. In Malachi 3:5, where God judges those who oppress the orphan, the widow and the orphan. And James 1:17 in the New Testament. 3.2 million children in the U.S. are considered orphans. 17 million worldwide have lost both parents. In many parts of the world, they are victims of slavery, prostitution, harsh work, and general abuse. According to adoption.org, there are 437,000 children in the foster care system on any given day. And I must once again give credit to Sean Thomas for finding this passage in Charles Dickens' book, Oliver Twist. Mr. Dickens did much to bring light to the plight of the orphan in England, writing, he was bagged and tagged and fell into his place at once, a parish child, an orphan of a workhouse, the humble half-starved drudge, to be cuffed and buffeted through the world, despised by all and pitied by none. His words stirred the hearts of many that day. How much more should our hearts be stirred as God's people? And I like what Gary Stevers said with regard to verse 23. If you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. Exodus 22, verse 23. The you in verse 22 is the plural, and the you in verse 23 is singular. Collectively, the nation should not mistreat widows and orphans, but if you individually do, God will know about it. Do you see the rule applies to everyone, but the responsibility is set at an individual level? This mimics the Israelite situation as slaves, where they cried out to the Lord because of their oppression, and he heard their cry. And this is Exodus 3, verse 7. The phrase translated as certainly here in the original language is the double use of the word here. It's something like, hearing, I will hear their cry. God will step in to fill the role of protecting them. David said in Psalm 68, 5 and 6, God in his holy dwelling is a father of the fatherless and a champion of widows. God provides homes for those who are deserted. Nothing escapes God's notice. And look at verse 24. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. The you is singular, since it's tied to the object marker in verse 23. In short, the responsibility to treat widows and orphans well is on the individual. If the consequence sounds harsh, it's because it is. The fifth commandment, to honor your father and mother, comes with the promise of a long life in the land God was giving you. The you here is plural. It's the nation. It has nothing to do with an individual's personal lifespan. That said, God's godly household is something of a barometer for the health of a nation. This verse says much the same thing. Putting these two thoughts together, we're to honor our father and mother, and the fathers and mothers of others. Violating this command could lead to death and ultimately exile from the land by an incoming army. God places himself in the role of both protector and punisher. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of a living God, Hebrews 10:31. Mistreatment of widows and orphans will result in their families suffering the same fate. David said, see, the wicked one is pregnant with evil, conceives trouble, and gives birth to deceit. He dug a pit and hollowed it out, but fell into the hole he had made. His trouble comes back on his own head. His own violence comes down up on top of his head. Psalm 7, 14 through 16. Jesus condemned those who took advantage of widows. He said, beware of the scribes who go around in long robes and who want greetings in the marketplaces. the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and say long prayers just for show. These will receive a harsher punishment. This is in Mark 12:38-40. Look at verse 25. If you lend money to any of my people with you who are poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Do not take advantage of someone's financial vulnerability. The first two use are plural and the third is singular, once again stressing the individual's responsibility in this matter, while the command is a global one. Further, the use of my people is defined by their being poor. It's okay to charge reasonable interest on someone who is not destitute. Can someone look up Matthew 6:3-4? And someone else look up Matthew 7:9-12. Matthew 6:3-4, Matthew 7:9-12. Can you think of any ways that our world legally takes advantage of those suffering financially?
Every credit card on the man.
I wrote that down. Payday loans, credit cards get people into a lot of trouble. Student loans, casinos have no problem draining someone's accounts, etc. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau says a typical payday loan often charges $15 per $100 borrowed for 2 weeks. It says that this equates to an APR of 400%. This is the kind of thing God is talking about. 6 days ago, NBC put out a headline: displaced Los Angeles area residents face spiking rents as authorities warn of price gouging. The ongoing wildfires have set off a stampede to find housing, lending some homeowners and property managers to raise rents higher than the 10% allowed during emergencies. One person saw a listing for a modest home going for $20,000 a month. At the risk of going down a rabbit trail on the finer points of loans in the Old Testament and what Deuteronomy further extrapolates, I think it's good to see what Jesus taught on the matter. Matthew 6:3-4. Who's got that?
But when you give to someone, don't tell your left hand what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in secret, and your Father who knows all secrets will reward you.
And Matthew 7:9-12.
I have it. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find it. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open. Or what man is there among you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone?
I think I got my things wrong. Can you read the next verse
Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent?
and the next one?
If you then, being evil, how to know to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?
And the next one.
Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law of the prophets.
There you go. Thank you. The Hebrew.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Maybe like a commandment.
Kind of sounds that way.
If you obey that golden rule, you're going to obey all 10 commandments.
Yeah. Pretty much.
Yeah. The Hebrew word interest comes from the word meaning to bite. It's a picturesque way of describing being in financial bondage. The interest on debts eats away at what you have. Adding interest to a loan adds to the distress of a person already in distress. Deuteronomy 15:11 says, "For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land." I have a second set of questions, but given the time, we're going to do it as a group exercise. Let's see. The average U.S. household has more than $100,000 in debt. How should we as God's church manage what we have and give to others in light of this current reality and biblical passage? How should we as God's church manage what we have and give to others in the light of this current reality?
Everybody should live on less than they make.
Yes.
And part of that is you're supposed to be able to save money so that there is money to help others. You're not supposed to spend all of your money on yourself. Partly what a tithe is for, and partly what offerings over and above a tithe are for. So,
Yeah, something to be said for stewardship is not merely the action of hedging your bets against uncertainty. but it's leveraging what you have for the sake of others.
I think it's the heart. Like it says in the Bible, don't covet. I think it's a matter of the heart. If you guard your heart to covet your neighbor's house or whatever they have, you won't be looking for what they have or better, So I think that's a hard thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need to have a heart that says God's portion for me is good enough, and going further, the doing to others, the golden rule, all these things, I think will put us into a position, in what God has promised for us to line us up with His will, and His will, of course, is His glory and growing His kingdom. And in doing that, we are honoring the Imago Dei, the image of God in others, when we leverage what we were stewarded for others. And I believe that He blesses that. And the next question is 4 here. So if you ever want to just chew on it on your way home and talk about something else, feel free to grab one of these on your way out. In what ways should the dignity of others be factored in when determining financial issues? Is it easy to make a passing judgment on somebody, assuming their situation, and then portion out just how much we're going to be generous based off of that? I think it's very human.
I think too, though, it can feel different is like, I know our son who lives in Memphis, they get by on very, very little. I mean, preachers don't make much. He's planning a church and they live in an expensive area and they don't have a lot. And it's, as a mother's nature, I want to give it to them. But they're not always receptive to that because they want to make on their own. But so I'm infringing on their dignity a little bit when I just say, here, take this. Here, take this. I know you need it. Take this. And then does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does. It reminds.
It's a way of passing judgment. I do the same thing for our kids. It's like when you do that,
You're saying
you don't mean it,
not enough.
but they're
You're not
seeing
doing
it
Yes.
as if you think I'm not good enough.
Yes.
I think we would do the same thing.
Yeah.
Even though our heart is, we want to help. It's
Right.
just funny that you said it because we do the same thing. Our kids are super unmaterialistic.
Right. And
They
so,
just
yeah.
don't require much.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just funny how
Yeah.
you let your opinion infringe on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's like your family and people that you love. So think how much you're probably doing that, to the general public. When you see someone and you pass judgment, oh, they must be homeless. Maybe they're not.
Maybe they do.
Maybe that's just their thing.
Right.
Maybe that's how they want to be. It's just, you never know how your mind is.
Yeah.
We've all heard stories about people who they tend to be homeless just to get a handout. I heard such.
Yeah. And in the former conversations, I feel like you can have the best of intentions on both sides. I also think that pride is a very nefarious thing, and it can affect both sides of it. The assumption on one way and the assumption on the other, coming from the other.
It's the root of all the sins, right?
That's in my study, that seems to be very accurate. Verse 25 is echoing the same spirit as the verses before it. People of God do not exploit each other, especially the vulnerable. Verse 26 through 27. If you take your neighbor's cloak in a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? If he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Here, we're talking about the issues of collateral. In this example, the person needing aid is so poor he is giving up his only jacket each day. It's pitiful. God is more honored by you just giving a person a financial gift and to play these games. Further, how do we expect to proceed to having real gospel conversations if we nitpick over things like this? But maybe I've missed some bigger point. The ESV says compassionate. Others use the word gracious. Gary Stevers says, This is the first use of the word gracious in the Bible. It's only used to describe God in the Old Testament. God demonstrated his grace by getting involved in Israel's situation in Egypt. He intercedes in the sin problem of the world. We should be gracious as God is gracious because it is his nature. Finally, our lesson has us flipping to Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Here in Leviticus, God is providing a sort of best practices directive. This is how you are to love people well. First, God is the provider of all things. The land is his, the crops are his, the water is his, the seasons are his. You are his steward, and by God's good pleasure, you can look around and see exactly the things that he has placed under your care. A job, a child, a spouse. How about a television, clothing, hygiene, functioning eyes, a sense of humor, etc. Everything we have is meant to be stewarded for the glory of God. Leviticus happens to use the real-world example of farming to illustrate this fact. We are to work hard, but not for work's sake, not to simply increase our bank account or status. What does this verse say? Leave them for the poor and the sojourner. Note, it is not saying reward the lazy. We'll later see how Boaz, in the book of Ruth, obeyed the Lord in this very thing. And this was used by God to become the great-great-grandfather of King David. We don't know the downstream effects of our obedience, where our downstream effects of obedience to God may be, but we can trust that he is faithful because with God, past performance is an indicator of future success. In conclusion, as Christians, you are sojourners. If we believe the promise of the gospel, we know that we're merely passing through this life, trying to take as many people with us as possible. Hebrews 13:14. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. I couldn't find the origin of the line, if I go out, I'm taking y'all with me. The internet robot told me Jesus said it in John's gospel, and I don't think that's true. But with the right heart, it is an admirable goal. Unfortunately, many Christians forget that this is not their permanent residence. I think we might have a little more compassion for those experiencing issues of belonging if we truly identified with our own reality in this fallen world. Similarly, for the Christian, you were widowed and orphaned by sin. You have been adopted to the sonship by the work of Jesus. Into sonship by the work of Jesus, welcomed into the church as the bride of Christ. Ephesians 1:5 says, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Christ Jesus, according to the purpose of his will. As the Israelites were encouraged to remember their time in Egypt, we should sympathize with the widow and the orphan because spiritually we have been there. We should have a greater love and compassion for them because of it, ultimately desiring their salvation. Finally, much like the man who only had a cloak to trade in, collateral for work, enough to buy back his own cloak, we have nothing to merit salvation. Ephesians 2:8, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing, it's a gift of God. So let's summarize. First, how we treat people reflects our beliefs about God. We can't separate our faith from our actions. As God's representatives, we reflect his character by protecting the vulnerable. Caring for the vulnerable is both for their sake and ours, and mistreating anyone violates God's desire for society and worship. We worship God by caring for those less fortunate. Second, it might feel like God is issuing directives regardless of the people's desire to cooperate. However, check out Exodus 24, verse 7. Then he, Moses, took the book of the covenant and read it to the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Similarly, for the disciple of Christ, we have agreed to honor the way God values others. It wouldn't take long for the Israelites to fail in their pledge to be obedient. After all, only Jesus obeyed the law perfectly, but we have the Holy Spirit which helps us to honor God in the way that we navigate the relationships with those around us. Luke 10:17, Jesus taught to love your neighbor. Upon hearing this, he was asked, and who is my neighbor? The goal was to find a loophole, to justify being kind to one person and the exclusion of another. As disciples of Christ, we do not get the option to pick and choose the people God puts in our lives. He sends them, we love them, simple as that. Today is Sanctity of Human Life Sunday, the Sunday closest to the original proclamation made by President Reagan on January 22nd, 1984. While the original date was to offer witness to the life in the womb in the post-ops time that we live in addition to honoring the preborn, I think it's good that Lifeway covered these verses, giving us a broader whole life, pro-life perspective. The church, when properly focused, has always been for the godly flourishing of individuals and families from conception to natural death. And just like we saw in our study, the directive is a plural one, stretching out to every Bible-believing body of people. But the responsibility is a very personal one. In response to the kindness shown to others, Jesus said in Matthew 25, verse 40, "And the king will answer them, 'Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me.'" And that is the lesson for January 19th, 2025. Holy God, we need you. You paint a picture of love that, if we're honest, is a hard concept to actively live out. We need your Holy Spirit to shape us into people who love people. Help us to see your image in others. Help us to be gentle, to be generous, to be welcoming. Give us your wisdom, your discernment, to understand how to live the Christian life well. We long to honor and glorify you because we know that this is what is best for us. Thank you for your word. Thank you for sharing your heart with us in this passage. Give us your Holy Spirit in a way that enables us to align our hearts with yours to the glory of your name and the expansion of your kingdom. In the holy name of King Jesus, I pray. Amen.